Welcome to the 304th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series about comics, illustration, animation, and the history of text image work. We're sponsored in part by the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation. Our guest tonight is Ryan Holmberg, who is a freelance arts and comics historian and translator. He's taught at Duke University and the University of Tokyo, among other schools. As an editor and translator of manga, he's worked with Breakdown Press, Drawn and Quarterly, Retrofit Comics, New York Review Comics, and Picture Box on over 24 different books. His edition of Tezuka Osamu's The Mysterious Underground Men from Picture Box won the 2014 Eisner Award for Best U.S. Edition of International Material from Asia. He's a frequent contributor to the Comics Journal and is the author of The Translator Without Talent from 2020 and Garo Manga, The First Decade, 1964 to 1973. That's from 2010. And his talk tonight is entitled Manga 4.5, Building Comics with Mats and Stones. So take it away, Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben, for having me. Thank you for New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium for having me. Let me go to the full screen. Okay. So tonight's talk is somewhat old. For the most part, my workflow was not disrupted by COVID-19. The one project that was this project, which is a collaboration with a printmaker named Bill Fick, who is in attendance tonight and whose work I'll show at the end. Bill Fick is a printmaker on the faculty of Duke University, where I taught 4 years ago. And 4 years ago, we co-taught a course called Unconventional Comics. It was a mixed studio and history/theory class about experimental comics. And I moved back to North Carolina 2 years ago, and we rebooted our collaboration by doing a project that was mixing screen printing, printmaking, and comics history, and also architecture. So this comes out of that. It was the exhibition that it was supposed to support was supposed to open about a year ago, but it got delayed, and it's probably going to open this summer. It's a handmade installation with some historical exhibits, but I'll talk about that at the very end. So not only is this, for me, kind of a reach out to try to collaborate with an artist coming out of my own area of comfort, but this is also kind of an old topic that I haven't really thought about for a year until about 9 a.m. this morning. So I hope you don't mind if it's a little rusty, but I'm getting back into it with the hope to finish it up in a couple of months from now. There are many people who have looked at the intersection of architecture and comics. I guess you could say even including Ben, the host of this talk. And this kind of springs out of that and kind of trying to looking at it from a different angle and from a more specifically Japanese angle. The title here, Manga 4.5, comes out of a type of arrangement of tatami mats. And the goal of the talk tonight is to explore if it's possible, even in a slightly deterministic way, to think of as tatami mats, and the paneling of comic books as somehow related and somehow being a strong influencing factor on the structuring of manga and manga paneling. Now, the reason I want to take this tactic, and why am I picking out tatami mats out of all architectural components? within Japanese rooms and buildings is that unlike in many cultures, space in Japan is oftentimes measured by the number of tatami mats. This is especially the case for domestic different types of room size. And I'm going to show later on examples in which it's possible to argue potentially that tatami layouts and the high visibility of a grid structure on Japanese floors influenced how comics were constructed in Japan in different ways, especially in the post-war period. Now, I'm sure many of you or most of you know what tatami mats are. They're made out of rush coating surfaces. Inside is traditionally, I think, wood chips or other types of straw and rush. More recently, it's usually made out of foam or some kind of plastic, as you see on the left. And they are arranged in rooms to create usually irregular grids. Now, tatami sizes range. You would think Japan being a fairly small country that there would be one standardized sizes for tatami since room sizes are measured by them. But between Tokyo, Kyoto, and Nagoya, the three big cities, three big urban areas, Kyoto, Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo, mat size changes a half centimeter or a meter. But for the purposes of today, we'll go through to what is close to the Tokyo size, which is a mat that is 0.9 times 1.8 meters size. So roughly more or less 3 by 6, the mat sizes are. So 3 by 6 mats. And because the mats are how they are, which is twice as long as they are wide, it leads to kind of a standardized but creative and visually attractive way of laying out mats in a room. And here you have different types of matting. I think here they're using the Kyoto size of tatamis. But at any rate, here you kind of see the different arrangements that are traditionally used in Japanese rooms. And even today, oftentimes when you rent a room or look up a room size or how big a room or an apartment is, oftentimes it won't be in square meters, but it'll be in tsubo. And tsubo is basically 2 mat sizes. So room sizes, even today, measured by mats. So you have a situation in Japan where the room sizes are essentially dictated by mat sizes and the arrangement of mats. And comics being a medium, which is oftentimes depicting interior spaces, and through those interior spaces, different types of drama is narrated. I kind of want to make the argument, or at least a hypothesis, to see in what ways matting or mat sizes also determine or shape the way that storytelling is done within Japanese comics. And as we will see, there will be some nesting, some overlapping between a page that's broken down into panels and a room that is broken down into mats. So maybe as like a rough analogy, you can think of the room is to the page as the mat is to the comic book panel. This is just a hypothesis. You'll see that some of my examples might be a little bit forced, but the idea is that there is this thing kind of lurking behind in shaping comics in Japan in different ways. Now, today I want to talk specifically about what is kind of the most famous and oftentimes idealized and romanticized arrangement of mats, and it is the 4.5 mats. In Japan, that's pronounced, you'll see at the bottom, yojohan, literally 4 tatamis and a half. It's 2 by 7 by 2 by 7 meters, or roughly 9 by 9 feet. And you see it on the left here. You can have multiple arrangements where you have the half mat in the middle or the half mat in one of the corners. But the yojohan has a long history in Japan and a very important history in terms of not just manga, but also ideals of bohemian artistic living in post-war Japan, particularly within manga, but also applying across the arts, including painters, musicians, etc. Now, when you say yojohan to people who know a bit about Japan, yojohan 4.5 tatami mats, the first thing oftentimes you think about is that the 4.5 tatami mat room was oftentimes used in tea rooms. It's not always the case. You also have examples of 1 mat, 2 mat, 3 mat, larger tea rooms. But some of the most famous tea rooms from the Japanese medieval period onward were 4.5 mat big. And the reason I point this out is to say that the romanticization of 4.5 mat rooms dates back quite far in Japan and is seen as an ideal space for social gatherings, especially. There's a saying in Japan that 1 mat is big enough to lie down on and a 1/2 mat is big enough to sit on. So mats and human body size were matched up oftentimes, or thought to match up. And in the tea room, a tea is where a host has a guest and ritually makes them tea and has them drink it, were conducted in these tea rooms. Here on the right, you're just seeing that each of the mats gets a different name. There is a mat for where the water is boiled. There's a mat for the utensils. There's a mat where the guests and the hosts sit, etc. And this is the alcove, which later on in Japanese history becomes the closet, essentially, where you, in 4.5 mat rooms that are adapted into residential apartments. Now, 4.5 mat rooms, aside from the tea house, usually did not exist by themselves. They were part of one room in a larger house. They're oftentimes, as I said, the room for entertaining guests. But in the, especially in the post-World War II period, 4.5 mat rooms becomes the standard size for apartments in Tokyo and other booming cities. 4.5 mat rooms, once they're divided from houses and are in different types of apartment buildings and boarding houses, what you find in the 4.5 mat room is basically just a living space and a closet for the person who lives there, with the kitchen down the hall, a communal kitchen down the hall, and a communal bathroom down the hall. Now, within manga and Japanese pop culture in general, especially by the 1970s, the 4.5 mat room kind of becomes this utopia, especially for young struggling artists who want to find cheap dwelling inside Tokyo while they try to make their way in the art scene or any other kind of cultural scene in Tokyo. And it's especially an important room for transplants from the countryside who are used to bigger houses, and where a 4.5 room would be one part of the bigger architecture of a house. But once they're in the city, the 4.5 room is the entirety of their living space. 9 by 9 feet is today, I think for people who live in the city, maybe doesn't strike you as that small, but you have to remember that oftentimes everything was crammed into this 9 by 9 space, and everything else was down the hall in a kitchen. So especially for Japan at the time, it was seen as a smaller space, and many people lived in sometimes bigger rooms, 6 mat rooms, and sometimes smaller rooms, 3 mat rooms, or even 2 mat rooms sometimes. Now, this is a poster of a movie made in 1980 based on a manga by someone named Matsumoto Reiji, who I won't talk about today, but he did some of the most famous 4.5 mat room romances in manga in the 1970s. This movie is called the original great 4.5 mat room epic. It's based on a manga from the early 70s. And you'll see here that off to the right that the square mat is on the corner, but you'll see also that there's kind of a square mat suggested in the middle as well, right? As I said before, the idea and the analogy of mats to body size, one mat was supposed to be the size comfortable for a person lying down. But you'll see that this person, he's poor. He's basically curled up to the size of a half mat, right? He's sleeping under not blankets, but newspaper. His underwear is dirty. He has no way to do laundry. So this idea that the human, the struggling artist, is reduced to a half mat size is symbolized in this poster. By his poverty is symbolized by his reduction in mat size as well. So there's all these analogies going on in manga and Japanese culture at this time between not just rooms and people, but especially mats and bodies and their social and economic state. And oftentimes, especially in the 70s, you'll see the square with the mat configuration serve as kind of an emblem of this universe of bohemian living in different ways. Now, specifically in manga history, when you say 4.5 mat rooms, most people think of, a structure known as the tokiwaso. The Tokiwa apartments was the apartment building that Tezuka Osamu, who is seen oftentimes as the godfather of post-war comics in Japan. He was from Osaka, another city. He was rich. He grew up upper middle class. He lived in a big house, but when he moved to Tokyo, he had to find a smaller room to live in. The second place that he lived in, and the place most associated with him becoming big in Tokyo, because all the major publishing houses are in Tokyo, was the buildings called the Tokiwaso apartments. And after Tezuka, he entered in 1953, I believe. He stays, I think, for about a year. And after him, a large number of other artists who became big, especially in the children's manga scene, entered after him. Amongst them, Fujiko Fujio, the duo who did Doraemon, Akatsuka Fujio, who's known for gag manga, Ishinomori Shotaro, who did Cyborg 009, all works that became huge manga hits and animation hits and merchandising hits in the 1960s and especially 70s, and many of which are still watched and loved, not just in Japan today, but also around the world. Now, because all these artists stayed in the 1950s from anywhere from a few months to a few years at the Tokiwaso apartment, a building, basically a boarding house made out of 4.5 mat rooms, the beginnings of post-war manga are associated with them and thereby associated with this building and associated with their struggles in 4.5 mat rooms. Now, recently, last year, in July of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, Toshimaku, one of the wards in Tokyo, funded by the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, opened the building that you see on the right, which was a full-size facsimile of the Tokiwaso apartments, which was torn down, I believe, in the 1980s. And this is one of the leading art magazines in Japan. They did a special issue about the opening of the Tokiwaso apartments. And these are images from it. This gives you a sense of what 4.5 mat rooms look like. There's an excruciatingly put together recreation of a boarding house from that period. And as you see, this is the second floor. The 4.5 mat rooms were arrayed down a shared hallway. And the rooms were, as you see, on the left. So you have a 4.5 mat room, and you see that all of the furniture, TV, which would have been very expensive at the time, books, tables, a writing desk, hibachi on the left for heating water to make tea, etc., stereo, whatever, are all inside this 4.5 mat room. So you have story after story about how the Tokiwaso artists struggled day and night to basically create children's manga as we know it in the post-war period inside these 4.5 mat rooms. And as I said, the mythology around the Tokiwaso is so great that the Tokyo government paid, I don't know how much, to reopen this reconstruction of the entire building. So you have this, which I've not been to since it only opened last summer. And here's a diorama of what it looked like with the artists in their sequential 4.5 mat rooms. Now, I want you to keep this in mind because you'll see that some of the manga I show you later by different artists, their drama basically occurs between these rooms through doorways and out the windows onto buildings surrounding. So a lot of drama, especially mystery manga drama, occurs through the doorways and portals of these 4.5 mat rooms. Now, this on the right is a study that the architectural firm called the Tanseiha made. They were the ones who designed the Tokiwaso recreation, the museum. This is a study of the room of Fujiko Fujio that they made. detailing not just the architectural layout, but where exactly items, personal items from ashtrays to the hibachi to the paper, everything were situated at one point in their manga by talking either to survivors or looking at their manga or looking at photographs, etc. And you can see that even in its ideal form as tidy for architectural reconstruction, that is quite messy, right? And in artists who lived in these rooms, the messiness of the room, that the kind of the latent 4x5 grid structure below this mass of smaller rectangles, books especially, cushions, tables, paper, rulers, etc., became kind of the mythology of what the struggling artist, the kind of space the struggling artist, cartoonist lived in while he was making manga. So there's this overlap between an artist living crammed inside a gridded room while making gridded pages, an artwork based on gridded pages. This is a book to give you a sense of how important, at least in the past, that Japanese comics critics thought. There's a whole book published in 1999 called Encyclopedia of Poor Manga. And the subtitle is The Paradise of the 4.5 Room. And there's one essay, they show you how you were supposed to depict poverty graphically. And it's structured around how you depict the 4.5 room. So here you have the bimbo method, the method of poor man's method of drawing, right? Based on the 4.5 room. And it shows that you use certain types of pen nibs, you draw in a certain way, you have the angle being at eye level. And if you want to make the non-poor man's method, make the 4.5 room look a little bit more chic, that you raise the angle, that you use a stiffer pen, that you use pre-printed screen tones rather than hash marks. And if you really want to get poor, you increase the density or non-density of the hash marking. So here you see that there's this book that's like a mixed history slash theory book slash drawing method book. And some of its entries are based around how to properly depict the 4.5 mat room in different ways to convey different types of emotions and different types of social situations. Now, what I kind of want to explore here on out is fairly easy to show that the 4.5 mat room is important to the mythology of manga, especially to the mythology of the struggling cartoonist in Tokyo after the war in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I also show that you can see some nesting and overlapping and how dramas are structured through different types of grids and portals within rooms. But one of the hypotheses I want to kind of explore, and I don't have a conclusion here, is that perhaps we can also see a change in how matted rooms are conceived within manga in relationship to changing paper sizes, and especially how the comics page is subdivided in different ways in manga over time. If you go from a tripartite division to a quadripartite division as paper sizes increase over time in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, I am going to do what I don't often do in talks, which is reads from something I wrote a while ago, because I trust what I wrote down a year ago more than what's in the back of my head from a year ago right now. So I'm going to read a little bit. I apologize if this is a little stiff, but I think this will be a little bit more reliable in terms of accurate information and organization of information. So the first, I'm going to look at, I think, about 4 or 5 examples. In the larger project, I think of about 15 examples dating from the 50s to the 1980s. But I'm going to look at about 5 examples that are associated with the history of rental book comics in the 1950s, and then the magazine Garo, which is known for as kind of the flagship of alternative and literary manga in the 1960s and 70s. So I'm going to look about, I think, 5 or 6 examples from specifically those 2 contexts. The first one is by an artist named Matsumoto Masahiko, and it's a short story called The Man Next Door. This story has been translated in a book from Breakdown Press in London in 2014, but it is extremely out of print and I think even if you pay a few $100s, you still cannot get your hands on it anymore. They're supposed to do a reprint. Maybe it'll happen in the near future. But at any rate, so here we go. Matsumoto is considered the progenitor of gekiga, dramatic pictures, the name for comics that tried to break with the childish and fantastical subject matter and slapstick humor that manga implied. Manga in this case would mean something close, the nuances of cartoons in English. Emphasizing that the sequence of paneled pictures versus expository text and action and dialogue inside single panels were to be the main vehicle of unfolding of plots, the fleshing out of characters, and the induction of effects of suspense and shock in the reader. Matsumoto called his new cartooning style komaga, which means literally paneled pictures. Many people have heard of the word gekiga. Gekiga means dramatic pictures or shocking pictures. Gekiga basically comes after komaga. Komaga was Matsumoto's invention, and it named basically panel pictures, the idea that you narrate, that you do storytelling within comics by paneling. Gekiga takes that and also adds a lot of brushwork, a lot of expressive sound effects and line work to kind of layer another layer of effects on top of the komaga paneling framework. Interestingly, the first successful work of Komaga, The Man Next Door, published in the inaugural issue of the Rento Kashihon periodical Shadow, structures this drama across two types of rooms. On one side, you have 2 4.5 or 6 tatami rooms, or 6 mat tatami rooms. That would be these rooms. In a 2-story wood-structured boarding house known as a geshuku, where a cartoonist and an angry drunk live. And across the way, a fairly large 1-story sukiya-style residence belonging to a wealthy crotchety man in his 60s or so who likes to play with guns. While the foregrounding of rooms is clearly related to Matsumoto's love of locked room mysteries and voyeuristic window-based thrillers, and is also a way to signify class in comics. Basically, poor immigrants, transplants, live in 4.5 rooms. Rich people live in full houses that have 4.5 mat rooms, amongst other rooms. There is more. The rooms mean more, even more than that in Matsumoto's work. Now, the mystery of this work, which is about a murder that can't be solved, about this man ends up dead, and they're trying to figure out who killed him, is presented as a story within a story. Oops. And on some pages, Matsumoto suggests an overt relationship between the man and his small matted room and the panel layout of the comics page. You see that nesting really happening very explicitly here. You have him drawn out, and then he's sitting on the, he's drawn out inside panels, and then he's sitting on basically panels which are mats. When the angry inhabitant of the boarding house kills the man across the way, we sense that the rooms, their position to one another, as well as the temperaments they engender, are as much to blame as the characters' personal backgrounds. Though a few cartoonists would make the relationship between mats, panels and rooms, and windows and frames so explicit, many would follow Matsumoto's lead in foregrounding rooms and architecture as central actors in the visual composition and plotting of stories. So basically you have this drama, this locked room mystery, which is set around, in this case, not a locked room because there's open doors, windows, but you have this mystery based in rooms of looking out through windows into other rooms, and that it's structured around a monk cartoonist who has to solve the mystery while also drawing a mystery in a set of matted pages, paneled pages. So I'm interested in this like shifting, this nesting between panels and mats and rooms and pages, especially around beginning with Matsumoto, whose very notion of proper dramatic cartoon storytelling is about focusing on the flow of panels. Now, my next example is Nagashima Shinji, Cruel Stories of Life as a Cartoonist. This has not been translated in English. Initially serialized in the Rento Kashihon periodical Detective, this title is famed in the history of Japanese comics for its heartfelt representation of young, struggling cartoonists and their desire to elevate the medium to a form of art, geijutsu, capable of moving young readers. Central to Nagashima's Bohemia are not only sartorial accoutrements like berets and portfolios, but also the rooms the cartoonists live in, typically 4.5 or 6 mat rooms and 2-story boarding houses again, and also the Spartan furnishings that go with them. Such settings derive from the artist's own experiences in the 1950s, as well as from stereotypes concerning where and how artists and other young immigrants to Tokyo lived, stereotypes which were ensconced in manga thanks most of all to the legend of the Tezuka and the Tokiwaso apartments. Yet, perhaps because he came out of the mystery Gekiga tradition that Matsumoto Masahiko helped initiate, Nagashima regularly mobilized 4.5-esque rooms as core generators of plots and pictorial composition and as occasions for subtle reflexive interplay between mats and panels. This is particularly the case in chapters of Cruel Stories that are drawn with a geometrical line that further unifies the geometry of the rooms and the multi-frame layouts. Now in Matsumoto, you'll see this a lot in manga afterwards. This kind of like focus on the 4.5 mat room from above. And it's something I think that I associate mainly initially with Nagashima's work. When Nagashima raises the ceiling and renders interior space from a bird's eye view that flattens the walls, floors, and furniture into patterns of squares and circles, one begins to suspect that the cult of the small matted room is itself now informing the composition, not unlike how fixed mat dimensions have dictated the size of rooms in Japanese architecture. You begin to wonder, in fact, if the layout themselves might be following a regular matting system. Going back to the early 1930s, the default basic division of the rectangular manga page was 3 horizontal rectangles, like what you're seeing on the left. The long side double the shorts, just like tatamis, by the way, but of different dimensions. Splitting the rectangles singly or multiply into square, with the most common subdivision occurring down the middle, splitting the rectangles singly or multiply into squares. So the idea here is that because you have a tripartite division on a certain size of paper that allows that you basically have kind of a tatami-like structuring of manga pages going on, where you have these, if you divide them down the middle, that you'll have these like half mats and full mats, an analogy within paneling. Nagashima held to this pre-war tradition, as Tezuka often did after the war, resulting most often in pages that were not 4 1/2 mat panels, alas, but rather 1 and 4 half mats. 1 and 4 half panels. I guess the slippage is intended, but it gets confusing, sorry. If Matsumoto's The Man Next Door plays with the small room as a cube with pregnant portals, Nagashima's more two-dimensional imagination, from Cruel Stories to later titles. Here we have a 6 mat room with pages on top of it and furniture on top of it, seen from above. In 1971, for Gado, he does a book called, indeed, The 4.5 Tatami Mat Room Tale. This work seems to be equally shaped by the room as a composite of mat and mat type units in the form of doors, walls, tables, and futons. This flat geometry is further emphasized by choosing not to represent the grain of tatami, abstracting the mats as blank rectangles. Later manga will not do this. So if you see here, there's like little, if you go back and look at some of these other ones, you'll see that tatami grain, the cross-hatching of the straw, is not depicted. Typically, you might have small details like this. And the result is that you have this kind of abstract geometry that resonates with the abstract geometry of the walls and therefore the panel frames. Now, as you see, as I'll show you later, over time, especially after page sizes increase and you no longer have this tripartite format, at the same time, manga artists start shifting to more and more depiction of grain for expressive purposes. Here you see that the grain is starting to creep up into manga architectural depictions in different ways. And it kind of displaces the nesting that was happening a lot in the 1950s and 60s between panels and mats. Now this manga is interesting because this artist struggles. He's not a cartoonist, he writes children's stories, but he eventually struggles so much that he dies at his desk. And inside you see, oftentimes in this manga, high moments of drama and tragedy occur within panels in which the 4.5 mat room is depicted very obviously. So here it zooms out and he's dead at his desk, right? You can see the middle square, he's dead at his desk. And later on, this is his funerary tablets. As they're remembering him, they situate his funerary tablet right in the middle of this space. So you start having this symbolism between the artist's body, and stand-ins for the artist's body situated inside the middle of the room, which was kind of a stand-in or a metaphor for his struggles. And usually it's a hymn. And here you have a friend coming back years later, meditating on the past and kind of looking more or less at the middle, at this blank space in the middle of this blank room, but the geometry very clear. Oh, wow. I'm gonna jump ahead if you don't mind, because it's already 40 minutes in. This is a work by Tsurita Kuniko. Tsurita Kuniko is one of the only regular female artists who contributed to the manga magazine Garo in the 1960s. Last year, I edited and translated a book, a collection of her stuff from Drawn and Quarterly called The Sky is Blue. This story is not in there, but this is a story about someone who I read, at least, given the gender of the artist, as a female cartoonist who is struggling, who's in her room, taking a break from drawing pages. And here you see the tripartite format that you see here. And in this one, it's kind of a meta locked room mystery. She's writing about a locked room mystery in which the man who's a criminal disappears into the wall. And slowly over the course of the story, you see that there's a focus on different types of grid systems. And after the person disappears in through the wall, why am I going backwards? That there's this increasing focus on the architecture of the room itself, and this kind of shrinking of the artist's room inside the panel so that the room itself becomes a panel within a panel. And this is kind of a forced comparison, but over the panels taken from different pages, but over the course of the story, you'll see that it kind of, you have in the beginning, you have these matted pages inside the matted room, and it zooms out, and then the room itself becomes a panel, and then it zooms out further, and then you can see that the whole room itself becomes like that half mat in the middle of some of the larger pages that are becoming more and more popular at the time. So here you have a very clear case of the tradition, the komaga, the panel picture tradition dating back from Matsumoto in its association with locked room mysteries, becoming, and also nesting of pages inside rooms and panels inside, and maps inside panels, becoming kind of turning into this meta mystery manga in which that is stated very clearly. Now, in the mid-1960s, as I said before, all of a sudden in Garo, for a variety of reasons, you have artists starting to emphasize more and more the grain of tatami mats. There's a number of reasons for this. One of that is the influence of photography. A lot of artists cartoonists at this time start sourcing their information from photographs, and they try to mimic in different ways the tonal gradations and details in photographs. The artist best known for that is Mizuki Shigeru, and Tsuge worked for Mizuki Shigeru from 1966 to 1970, was influenced by his techniques of using photographic sources, especially for backgrounds. And in Tsuge's work, you start seeing more and more the grain of the tatami mats. This isn't a tatami mat. This is a different type of kind of like a rush throw carpet of some sort. But more and more you see there's a focus on thatching, wood texture, and tatami mats. But at the same time, you have this more classical komaga and naga shinji thing, where you have a zoomed out image that's zoomed out so that the reader can spend more time looking inside the room, in which you have these people, in this case, one dead person and 3 people faking sleep in the middle of the room. And the drama in this comic unravels from there. This story will be in the second volume of the Tsuge series coming out from B&Q this summer. And as my last example before I move on to my collaboration with Bill Fick is also in Red Colored Elegy. another famous work, and also one that's available in English from Gato, you kind of see the shift once again from this interest in the mats from a geometric perspective to an interest in the mats as more of an expressive vehicle. That by emphasizing matte grain, the rush grain of the mats, that you depict psychological states and changes the narrative in different ways. But at the same time, in Hayashi, you also see kind of a commitment through to an older kind of a cleaner gritter tradition in manga. And this story revolves around two struggling animators. They're freelance animators. They draw animation cells. And here again, you can see that probably they're in a matted room, but in this case, the mats have been blotted out by abstraction. Meanwhile, on top of the mats, on top of a square table, they are making panels. But over time, as the story develops, especially the young man, he's a transplant from the countryside into Tokyo. He starts having troubles with his family and with his girlfriend. And over the course of the story, as his emotional and relationship troubles advance, more and more you get to focus on dark spaces, black spaces, but also more and more the tatami grain starts coming out. So happiness in this manga is no grain and no mats. But as over time it develops, as it becomes more unhappy, that mats and grains, especially in an expressive way, begin to assert themselves. You also see that in areas without mats with wood grain. Here you have him at a kotatsu table, a heated table, which you oftentimes see in these rooms, the grain sneaking out. He comes back home. He lives somewhere in snowy, rural northern Japan. And the minute he comes home, it's a dark room, and part of it is emphasis on the grain. And especially after his dad dies, there's a real emphasis on him being surrounded and absent bodies being surrounded by ever-strengthening tatami grain, like here. So this is just to say that also that in Japanese manga, tatami mats are not just background, right? They're a very important part of how you structure rooms, drawn rooms, how you think about the relationship between architecture and paneling. And also over time, they become an important way of thinking about how you think about the relationship between architecture and artists and characters' emotional states of mind in social situations. So mats, just as they're very unpopular in how Japanese rooms and buildings are shaped, they're also very important to the language of manga in different ways. Well, this is some of the last panels in the manga. Now, I'm going to show you the project that Bill Fick and I are collaborating on. It's mainly Bill doing the work. I'm just providing him some ideas. And one of the places we do he gets a lot of his artist materials from various places, but we get a lot of our ideas. We shop in Gato. We shop in manga like Red Colored Elegy for ideas about how to make things. So we pull from ideas like this, what were in rooms, what did the furniture in rooms look like? And, sorry, I'm skipping over things that people probably want to hear about. But, so this is, initially the idea was we were going to build, or Bill was going, I say we here, but like I said, Bill's doing all the hard work on the art side, the 99% of it. He started building a structure on the campus of Duke University where he teaches. And it was supposed to be 2 different rooms, each size 4.5 mat big. And we were going to put different furniture in it related to the cults, what you would have found in 4.5 mat rooms back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially as the rooms were romanticized inside manga. So you have a kotatsu, a heated table, a zabuton, a seating cushion, bookshelves. And then we're going to do a rock display associated with Man Without Talent. I didn't talk about how Man Without Talent is related to this history, but take my word, it is in a way. So this was the first idea, and he built this building, and then the pandemic hit, so we can't use it. So he's using it for other things. Meanwhile, inside Bill's studio, he's building this. This is taken about a month ago. I think it's a little bit further along. It's this plywood structure covered in paper, covered in different types of paint. I know Bill's there. Maybe he can explain the materials better. And inside, on the outside, the plan is, but we'll probably do this this summer. On the outside is we're going to paste images of manga and narrate the history that I've been narrating in this talk. So we'll basically do using reproductions, of course, printouts. We'll do a mini history of manga 4.5 on the exterior walls of this structure. Inside will be a reconstruction of the 4.5 mat room in wood and paper. Now, these are shoji screens. These will be like the paper screen doors that we will put in different places. The walls will be a mix of beige and screen printed wood texture. And Bill, with his classes and also on his own, has been creating different textures, rock textures for the rock display, tatami textures, and creating objects like this. This is a wood plank that will be used for the display of rocks. Inside is, what do you call it? Heavy duty fortified cardboard covered with a screen print of wood texture. And if I showed you more images, it's kind of mimicking the type of wood texture that you find in Hayashi Seiichi's manga, but also in photographs of 4.5 mat rooms. This is a print that he's making using washi paper. I think he took this motif from some kind of icon that you find on the outside of cardboard shipping boxes in the US, and reprinted it to make a pattern of what you oftentimes find on textiles used for quilts and futon in Japan. Using this paper, modeling his rocks, which I didn't talk about, on rocks that he finds from a rail track that runs outside of Duke University. So he's making these rocks, which are also associated with a longer history of ascetic reclusion in the 4.5 mat room in bohemian life in Japan. And then this is what the mats are going to look like. He's completed most of them. So you have these screen printed surfaces on cardboard, and with the heady, what do you call it? There's these bands that run dividing the mats. And this is what the doors will look like. And here you see the zabuton, right? That paper used as a seating cushion. And he's going to make a kotatsu, a heated table too. So that's it. So this will be the components of it. And hopefully this exhibition will open up sometime in the summer in Durham in Bill's studio. And as I said before, inside it will be a 4.5 mat room made out of paper based on manga. And on the outside will be an exhibition about the very manga on which this idea is based. So that's my talk. I probably have about 5 or 10 other examples, not in this PowerPoint, that I'm going to be talking about in the exhibition. This kind of history goes until about the 1980s, and then only exists in nostalgic expressions after that. So this is the ideas I'm working about on the relationship between mats, panels, rooms, and manga pages. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. Let's try to open up. Let's bring us back so we can see everybody.
Should I read it? Should I? Let's see.
So if you have a question, just drop your name in the chat, and we can free you up. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, I had so has anyone used that standard central overlapping 4.5 room layout for a comic strip, which seems like, I mean, there are lots of comics designed like that. People do that in American comics and European comics, a central panel with a sort of a constellation of panels around it.
I mean, you'll see some, very much less often in manga, you'll find like a central panel and then some kind of spiraling display around it. See it much
Right.
less in manga. And the other thing is, like in manga, as experimental as many Japanese cartoonists are, there's certain things that have largely not changed within Japanese manga that restrict the art, which are almost everybody works in monochrome, black and white, and also that almost everyone publishes first in magazines. And magazine paper size is always the same size. So you can never experiment, say, with square pages. There are some examples of square-shaped children's manga from before the war and after the war. But if you want to make manga and get it published, you have to work within a rectangular page. And very rarely do you see, I mean, I can definitely think of examples, but very rarely do you see that kind of using that central panel in a spiraling composition like you would see in a 4.5 mat. There's very few square pages in manga to begin with. So any kind of potential translation of matting to cartooning would have to, first of all, find a way to translate from square to rectangle in subdivision. Does that make sense?
Right. But the larger rooms sort of start, in that first slide you showed, they start to be rectangular.
Yeah.
Right.
There's nothing, I haven't found anything that's super explicit, but you're asking one with
that's why when you showed those, I immediately said, can you make a comic strip out of that grid? And if you could, it would be a kind of not always easy to read, know which way to go, but you could do it literally, follow those grids.
Right. If you just stack them, or if you put one in the corner, I think it maintains kind of a clear reading direction. Right. Once you start doing a kind of a more spiraled panel layout, I think it starts confusing intentionally what the reading direction should be. And in manga, especially magazine manga until the 1970s, I think even to the 1980s, magazine editors had a lot of control. And one thing they were very specific about is that you had very clear reading. So even into the mid 1960s, manga panels were numbered. So I think editors, publishers would have not been open for the most part to people experimenting with layouts that intentionally confuse reading order.
Okay. There's a question from Margarita. You could unmute
What helped you see this pattern initially to investigate it? So her question is, what helped you see this pattern initially to investigate it further? This project was initiated mainly by Bill Fick. Bill wanted to do a collaboration, and I believe he liked The Man Without Talent, Tsuge Yoshiharu's book that was published by New York Review of Comics last year. And he was really interested mainly in the idea of the stones. And then from the stones, I didn't talk about this today, but for me, the stones and the mats went together in different ways. But I'm trying to remember now why I also wrote some essays in the past about the language of gekiga, of mystery manga in the 1950s. And one thing I never ended up writing about, I wrote about speed lines, I wrote about eyes, I wrote about clocks. And one thing I wanted to write about was rooms. So I think after Bill started pushing me on the stones, I started thinking also about rooms and mats. I think that's how it started. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, there's a question from Paul. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, it's nice to hear these.
Okay.
If he wants to, if you want to unmute yourself.
Should I read
it? Sure. Just, is there a precedent in other forms, whether it's like Japanese screens or ukiyo-e, for these thematic elements involving tatami mats?
You definitely see it a lot in ukiyo-e, in woodblock prints, and before standalone single leaf woodblock prints, standalone leaf woodblock prints. You also see it in woodblock printed books in Japan. Oftentimes, where you have a very heavy focus on kind of an very almost abstract images of rooms, which the tatami are very strongly emphasized. And even going back further to emaki, picture scrolls, you know, a way to depict interior narrative is to blow off the roof and show the activity inside. And going back to some of the earliest picture scrolls in Japan, like the Tale of Genji, you find a very clear emphasis and kind of echoing between matting and walls and other types of furniture, and also sometimes with characters' interior, kind of interior psychological states. So yeah, there's a longer history from in picture narratives in Japan. Now, to what extent do those precedents influence manga? I would hesitate to say that the influence, if there is any, is big. But I'm sure if I were to dig more into 1930s manga, that like transitional period, you could find I could probably find examples in which there is a suggestion that they're looking at prints and how tatamis and spaces, room spaces, are depicted in prints from an earlier period.
Right. So wait, so you said the influence, when you said it's not, you said it's big or not big? Did you just say
on comics?
On comics, yeah.
I don't think Japanese cartoonists' interest in this, in matted rooms, in how those can be used as pictorial devices, that comes out of woodblock prints. I'm sure if I had dug into 1920s and 30s manga, I could find examples in which the artists are very clearly modeling their image making on those precedents. But I don't get the sense, especially in the post-war period, that that is the primary influence. If anything, it's probably cinema or any.
So is anybody in post-war manga using parallel perspective, or is everybody using a Western perspective? By would that thing ever come back as a?
I mean, it toggles. It toggles. It toggles even within this one work, right? I mean, unlike painting, I think like not only does perspective change in each individual panel oftentimes, but I think also like perspectival laws change in each panel in often cases. So you might have an isometric space or parallel lines in one panel, and then for a long bird's eye view or a view from a mountain, you have a more strict linear perspective view. And then and it's, to the extent that there's any kind of rule, quote unquote, rule being used at all. But.
Okay. And there's a question from Michael.
Oh, you can go to Jonathan Bass first.
Oh, okay.
First.
Jonathan, you can.
All right, thank you. Hi, Ryan. Thanks. That was really interesting, and I've always enjoyed looking in manga the sort of aerial views of rooms, looking down and to see the extra context, or to get the extra context from you is really helpful. So one thing that occurred to me as you were showing us all those examples was the difference between the sort of the regular rectilinear geometry of the mats in contrast to the sort of overlapping and cluttered nature of the room. So you got all these objects, bodies, furniture, papers all over the place, sort of interfering with that regularity. And then that regularity is reclaimed with the panel layout as that you're directing us to. So that there's this contrast inside the panels that doesn't happen outside the panels, because the panels tend not to, things don't overflow the panels, they stay within inside the panels. Right. So yeah, I was just wondering is there any, do you see any sort of play or attention to that in the work? Does the work, do the artists themselves notice or exploit that contrast between the overflowing of the geometry within the panel versus the containedness outside the panel.
That's interesting. Are you asking like if you ever see like cluttering overflowing onto the actual panel breakdown?
Yeah, or just or some sort of acknowledgement of that distinction within the sort of composition or whatever or action that even that happens inside the panels.
It's an interesting question. Nothing's coming to mind. There's that one I showed in which the guy dies, and there's, you know, the funerary tablet in the middle. I mean, there's a kind of like a narrative progression from like life to death, from clutter to cleanliness. So I think sometimes it's like inscribed inside the narrative as well. I mean, one thing is like, you know, later on in the 1980s and 90s, when, you know, Japan really booms economically and people become obsessed with everything Japan and Japanese space as an idea, there are a number of books, architecture books, exhibitions, photography books about Japanese Tokyo apartment spaces. And sometimes they are structured around the idea of the 4.5 mat room. And at that point, really, that juxtaposition is really highlighted. Like you have these Japanese who are living what, for I guess many outsiders seem like small rooms, but they're highly cluttered. You know, Japanese being voracious consumers, yet they live in these small places. What do they do with all the stuff? Well, they stack it all in the rooms. And you actually start seeing that in manga in the 1970s in a way. But what you see is not a clutter of affluence. You see like a clutter of poverty in a way, like all the person's clothes are strewn out all over the place. All their books. If they own one thing, they're going to own books, you know, especially for these artists. And because the stories are also about poor artists, not only they're living in a point in Japanese history where people own less stuff, but the characters themselves are poor, so they're going to own less stuff. So this like stuffiness of the panels, I think there's reasons they probably aren't as cluttered just on a material cultural level for the 50s and 60s and 70s, unless they're cluttered with books or messy manga pages, right? But you ask a good question, like how does that clutter play? You know, you sometimes see, I think there's examples here where it's like, again, they're playing with the clutter in the sense of like, sometimes they'll get frustrated or something bad will happen and the manga pages will like fly everywhere. It's like the moment in which disaster happens for the person. So it's like once, and sometimes this is the kind of thing where it's like, I don't know if I've seen an example or I can use an imagined example where it's like, at that point, the panels themselves start twisting and flying around. Like, you know, that the panels become literalized pages. Mm-hmm. And I bet if I dig a bit, I can find an example that's like that, where it's like the dissolution of the geometry of the room becomes a dissolution, becomes clutter inside the panel and then a dissolution of the paneling itself. But again, oftentimes, you know, it's like kind of thing of like, if you have these structures that are seem to me like prevalent, and you imagine that something like that could be, and if you dig long enough or you just wait long enough, you will find something that more or less matches up with what you wanted to find.
It's the fun of research and
for sure.
And the good portion of it. Yeah. All right, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you want to, Michael?
Yeah, thank you. So I have a copy in the other room of Man Without Talent, but I haven't read it yet. Could you summarize briefly what the stones thing was that you didn't have time for? This was very interesting theory.
So the stones, there's two things. It's like, so the obvious side is the stone side, and the stones would have a longer history. This comes up in the manga too. There's these amateur stone appreciators that they collect or either find river stones or they buy river stones and they appreciate them as aesthetic objects, which has a long history in East Asian literati culture. You know, Chinese color rocks, and you have different types of stones, and you have rock gardens in Japan, et cetera, right? And the manga is kind of playing off that and kind of parodying a history of literati refinement within Japanese culture. In the manga, especially in the beginning, you see that the protagonist is selling his stones from a small beat up kiosk. And that beat up kiosk too is kind of playing on that history on history of a recluse male scholar retiring to the mountains, writing poetry, thinking about impermanence of existence while living inside a very small room. And in Japan, sometimes those rooms in Japanese literature, sometimes those rooms are literally 4.5 mat size. So there's this, not just tea rooms, but there's also this kind of history, this cult of male literary reclusion that goes with the 4.5 mat room or smaller out inside in the countryside. And that kind of comes up in manga in a citational way more and more in the 1970s, that these 4.5 mat rooms as the abodes for bohemian cartoonists are somehow drawing on an older tradition of literati reclusion within Japanese culture. And then the other side of it is that though Man Without Talent has that fantasy in it, the fact of the matter is that the protagonist lives in what is called a 2 LDK. LDK means living dining kitchen. It's a type of Japanese apartment where basically you have 2 rooms and a combined living room, dining room, kitchen. And the 2 rooms are sized in most of these houses, also in the case of the place where Tsuge lived in the 70s and 80s, one is sized 4.5 mats and one is sized 6 mats. So it gets complicated after the 1960s and 70s, because in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the artists, cartoonists lived in these wood structure boarding houses, which oftentimes, but not always, were composed of a series of 4.5 mat rooms. But a lot of those buildings start getting torn down in the 70s and 80s. They weren't meant to last. A lot of them start moving to ferro concrete buildings with apartments with multiple rooms. So kind of my question is, how does that old 4.5 fantasy from the wood boarding house transfer to these kind of more modern apartments that are designed for nuclear family living? If that makes sense. I'm sorry that was very long, but that's my idea.
No, that was great.
So there's actually
Thank you.
photographs. I mean, I actually have one of like Tsuge posing, because he becomes kind of a media star in the 70s and 80s, but posing in different rooms of his 2 LDK apartments, posing as a scholar, posing as an artist. And it was kind of what I want to do is kind of like draw out that connection with the older history of 4.5 mat rooms and their romanticization. How do you, because the manga, Man Without Talent is kind of about that. How do you continue to uphold those older ideals of bohemian living from the 50s and 60s, and even further back, in Japanese culture, after you have a wife and kid and living in a, what people would consider a boring, colorless public housing complex or something.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting. And the cruel stories of the lives of cartoonists, you said that wasn't translated. Do you know of any plans to do that from yourself or anyone else?
I would like to. I mean, the most immediate end for this research is to use it in the collaboration with Bill Fick, but we've been talking about doing a publication out of it. And the publication ideally would be my writing with images, photographs, and other things related to Bill's installation. And then also maybe a selection of 2 or 3 manga stories related to this history that aren't already translated and licensed, or ones that are easily licensable. And I feel like one of the ones that would have to be in there is at least one story from Cruel Stories of Youth, or Cruel Stories of Cartoonists. So I think that's the most likely way that it might get translated, at least by me. The whole manga, it's quite long. It's all short stories. I think all together they number about 400 pages or so, and they're not all good. One could do a smaller selection of them that would be interesting. Maybe I'll do that. We'll see. It's not high on my list. So the most likely thing is it to be part of an anthology related to this research.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, it sounded very interesting. Thanks so much for this.
Sure.
Question from iPhone. There is a door phone. I'm not sure what that's. No. iPhone, did you want to unmute?
Oh, sorry, not me. Should I read it out?
You could read it, yeah, sure.
So from iPhone, there's a question that says, Gato and other alt manga of this time period, late 60s to mid 80s, seems very class concerned and conscious. Is this a continual thread in contemporary alt manga? I would say not as much. Contemporary alt manga, it depends on how you define that, but there is a group of younger alt manga artists, mainly men, young men, who look back very nostalgically to Gato of this period, 60s, 70s, 80s. And in their work, you see very much kind of the replication of these tropes at both a thematic level. You know, you have images of struggling cartoonists in small rooms, but also at a graphic level where they're trying to replicate some of the quote unquote, you know, impoverished drawing that I talked about in the beginning of the stories, with sometimes an emphasis on matting. And there's one young cartoonist named Kawakatsu Tokushige, who's also a critic and historian. He's written a very interesting article about 5-6 years ago about the history of tatami grain, not gridding, but grain, especially within manga. So there are artists, especially ones who are interested in, to the point of being enamored with, manga of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So the impact of Gato into the present also includes the continuation of some of these romantic tropes about bohemian artists and how you depict them in spaces into the present. Now you say alt manga of this time period seem very class concerned and conscious. That's definitely the case. That comes out a lot of the fact that a lot of them grew up poor and remained poor, you know, oftentimes the 60s or 70s, and especially romanticizing the 1950s in a very different way than, say, baby boomers of other countries do. But that whole idea that Japan was reduced to ashes and that the baby boomer generation worked hard and created contemporary Japan as we know it. So a lot of times when they're depicting their hardscrabble roots, they go back to their years they go back to the 1950s and really focus on the different type of architectural spaces and sensory surrounds of those periods. So they're definitely class concerned because a lot of them came out of a poor background. But in terms of a political class consciousness, I'd say very few of them were. In fact, you know, a lot of the main editors, critics, and artists associated with Gato expressed in very clear terms their distaste for organized politics.
Anybody else? So when you say that, so were they anarchists or just not interested in?
I don't think they're interested. Most of them weren't interested in politics whatsoever. You know, usually a lot of the times it's framed as, you know, a lot of them, you know, this first generation of Gato artists, all these artists are working in the 50s and 60s in rental books or in early magazines. You know, a lot of them only had middle school education. So a lot of them started working in their mid-teens full-time in factories, and janitors, various types of, you know, undesirable manual jobs while they were cartooning, or, you know, when they didn't have money from cartooning. So, you know, a lot of them experienced, I think, firsthand, like attempts at unionization from the Japanese Communist Party, the jobs they had. But I think a lot of them from what I understand, a lot of them just felt that a lot of the leaders of political movements, either back in the 1950s or in the student movement took off in the 1960s, those people were from a different class. A lot of them were college, especially in the 1960s when the student movement, political student movement takes off in Japan. A lot of those people were middle-class kids who had too much time on their hands to think about ideas of revolution, where they had to work hard from their mid-teens and they didn't have any time to think about these issues. And not that they believed that everyone who worked hard would get on in life, but I think from their perspective, a lot of the political discourse that was circulating at the time that was speaking presumably in their favor is actually coming from a class other than their own. So yeah, a lot of them are just plain apolitical or even anti-political, a lot of their statements.
Mm-hmm. There's a question from Antec. Do you want to ask that?
So I'll read it. Has there been any study of the line quality in manga? It seems over time the drawings become less loose and curved lines become replaced with more angular lines. I showed an image at the beginning of, towards the beginning of the talk. I don't know if you saw that, where like, you know, loose line work was associated as a very conscious stylistic decision in order to depict certain types of class-based spaces, I guess you could say, or at least of poverty. That if you wanted to show poverty, and especially if you want to show early post-war poverty, you would use a different line work than you would to show living in small cluttered spaces in an era of affluence, which would be cleaner line work. But you know, a lot of times that only applies, or largely applies only to certain sectors of Japanese manga. Generally, artists who were writing for Garo or for rental books in the 1950s were allowed a much freer choice of drawing style. And if you were drawing for magazines, they generally wanted tighter line work. And not to say that it was either angular or rounded. You know, a lot of times magazine drawing styles, especially up until the 1960s, were heavily influenced by the type of cartooning that Tezuka Osamu had done, which is much more based on a sense of cartoon figuration as an assembly of spheres and circles and rounded surfaces. And it's really, say, with someone like Saito Takao and Gogo 13 that you see much more angularly constructed characters. And then also in the 1960s, 70s, you have a lot more use of prefabricated materials for the construction of manga, especially for backgrounds and for speed lines and for effects. And a lot of those times, those being mechanically produced stickers or things that you paste on the page, those would tend to be more rectilinear and regular. So I think over time, as manga became less purely hand-drawn, you also find that not only that there's less hand-drawn, that obvious hand-drawn facture in manga, but that the hand-drawn parts are drawn more cleanly so that they match up better with the mechanically produced parts of manga. That's just a general impression. I'm sure you could find a lot of exceptions. All right, Rory P has a question. You want to ask it yourself? Because my voice is starting getting hoarse. Oh, his mic doesn't work. Ben, can you read it?
Yeah, well, yeah, it seemed like this was the your thesis. It seemed like a lot of the examples of tatami-themed influenced work you showed tonight featured manga artists in their studios or rooms. Is it deliberate that they would be influenced by these mats in their rooms? Yeah, spending all day grinding away in these rooms.
For
Do
sure.
these panel-like mats subconsciously influence their page design?
Yeah, I
yeah, I
mean,
think that seems to be your thesis, right?
yeah,
One of
that's,
you.
I mean, that's the basic thesis. And I think over time, especially, you know, after Tezuka and his acolytes start writing a lot about how they made their way through the Tokiwaso apartments, living in 4.5 mat rooms, there's not only this kind of maybe natural bleeding of reflecting the spaces you live in inside the comics, or reflecting the spaces you're depicting inside the comics, but also that to depict artistic struggle in manga means also depicting the architecture of 4.5 mat rooms. You know what I mean? It's not just, if you want to show a struggling artist, you don't just show beads of sweat or a beret, but you also show the 4.5 mat room. So it becomes part of like one of the accoutrements of a struggling artist. The 4.5 mat room goes with them.
Okay. Anybody else? Oh, follow-up question from Michael.
Yeah, it occurred to me, like a lot of just in that question and answer, a lot of the examples you used were these semi-autobiographical works. I mean, with the exception of something like that murder mystery, I guess. But even that is about a manga artist.
Right.
Would you say a lot of these 4.5 mat pages or examples that you've noticed are specifically about manga artists,
yes,
and cartoonists?
Maybe I should have made that more clear, but yes, they are either about cartoonists, they're semi-autobiographical, they're autobiographical fiction, or they are autobiographical. And I have to say, you know, that the kind of this whatever, this covert history that I'm talking about, like it doesn't speak for manga at large. When I'm talking about, all the artists I'm talking about are well known in manga history, but 99% of manga would probably not reflect this history because of restrictions on drawing styles, different types of subject matter, doing fantasy, for example, not having settings. Tezuka mostly did fantasy. A lot of his manga were set in the United States or in the jungle or in outer space or whatever it is, or in, big fancy buildings. So you might have him in a comical moment, in a self-reflexive comedic moment, showing a 4.5 mat room, but overall, I don't think you couldn't make this argument for matting and paneling in a work like his. It requires a turn to, like as you said, basically it requires the turn to autobiographical fiction that you see in the 1960s for it to really kind of stand out in manga. So yeah, you're right. It's not completely, but more or less specific to a certain genre of manga making.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we can, any other questions? If not, we can thank you for that really great view of Japanese comics.
Thank you. It's still a working idea. So
yeah,
I appreciate everybody's thoughts. And I think one of the things I need to do is not just look at manga, but think about cross examples of architecture in comics more broadly, and see how manga kind of like map against those histories and ideas.
Right. Okay, thank you. And we'll see everybody next week.